Hello, everyone out there. I'm going to talk to you today about war and peace in a small post-colonial nation, Trinidad and Tobago, which I'll refer to as Trinidad. I've just published a history of Trinidad, and my talk will pull one strand out of that work, education, and try to show how the general theme of this series, peace and conflict, manifests through the medium of education. As I look through another talk on this website by Ozod Abu Sabur, talking about the peace process in Central Asia and Afghanistan, I was struck by the sense of scale. That is a large theater. Its dynamics and outcomes affect global power relations. My discussion of Trinidad is kind of the opposite. Trinidad is minuscule, a small node in a large interconnected web. It is a very small tableau. It's been described as an experimental enclosure where social experiments were conceived in the colonial period. However, the benefit of this scale, the very small size, is that the dynamics can be examined close up and local issues can be examined as illustrations of larger principles. The whole process can be thought of as a fractal, a small shape which mimics the character and dynamics of the whole. Of course, I hope to make a larger than local statement, so I'll be drawing parallels between what's happening in Trinidad and the post-colonial world and the cultural politics of the post-Obama United States, which have an inordinate effect on politics, culture, and society in Trinidad. Ordinarily, I would assume you know very little about Trinidad, but some of you might have been introduced to the island in the last few weeks through the medical issues of rapper Nicki Minaj's cousin's friend. Nicki Minaj is from Trinidad, as was V.S. Naipaul, and Derek Walcott was a naturalized Trinidadian. Our first prime minister was the historian Eric Williams, who wrote one of the foundational historical texts of the 20th century, Capitalism and Slavery. C.L.R. James, one of the 20th century's most eminent Marxist thinkers, was from Trinidad, and so was Rudyard Capildeo, an eminent physicist. And so is Stefan Alexander, an eminent physicist in the current time, and a recent past president of the US Association of Black Physicists. So was Kwame Ture, a pivotal figure in the Black Power movement in the United States. The intellectual output of this small island in terms of artists, scientists, social theorists, and activists is astonishing, way out of proportion to its size and population, about 1.4 million. I should also mention that local population or local populism is overtly and overly preoccupied with the Trinidad Carnival, and that's all I'm going to say about that. What makes Trinidad unlike most of the Caribbean is its racial mixture. About 40% of the population is of Indian origin, 59% is of African origin, and this includes the ethnic mixtures captured in the term mixed other. There is a semantic distinction between African and mixed other, but this is a local conceit. In Trinidad, Tracy Ellis Ross, Rashida Jones, and Robin Thede would be considered mixed other, but in the US, they are Black women. The other 1% of Trinidad's population is comprised of European, Chinese, and Arab people. The only other Caribbean territory which has a similar ethnic mix is Guyana, but its problems are more complicated and more violent than Trinidad's. Trinidad became independent in 1962 and a republic in 1976. Its government has been dominated by one ethnically based party, the People's National Movement, which has held government for 49 of the 59 years since independence, including an unbroken stint from 1956 to 1986. The PNM used its time in government to define the state as Black or African, deliberately to erase the political potential of the Indian community. This means institutions, culture, art, and public discourse are designed to foreground the experience and the presence of the Black group. But engineering the society created distortions, corruption, incompetence, and anarchy that have defined Trinidad and Tobago. The racial politics began in 1958, and the island has been embroiled in conflict ever since. The 60s were fraught with protests, government witch hunting, states of emergency, and repressive legislation to halt the labor movement. This culminated in the Black Power uprising of 1970. Throughout the 1970s, Black Power stopped, but its radical splinters continued waging guerrilla war with robberies, bombing campaigns, and domestic terrorism. This continued into the 1980s, and in 1990, there was another uprising, the Muslimin coup attempt. All these were the result of the political economy of race, where economic and policy decisions were taken to preserve power rather than to create a better society. Among the consequences was demographic collapse, as 300,000 people emigrated between 1960 and 1990. That's about 35% of the population. I should say here that Trinidad is a place where the more money it earns, the worse the society gets in terms of crime, emigration, and corruption. The migration and demographic and political reorganization provided an opportunity for a multi-ethnic political opposition to coalesce, and in 1995, an Indo-based political party, the United National Congress, UNC, made itself sufficiently attractive to attract enough non-ethnic voters to acquire government twice. Much like the post-Obama United States, this reformation was met with a strong counter-reformation, as Afrocentric ethnic apologists emerged and began espousing a strident Black nationalism which cast the Indian population as the antagonist and oppressor. The consequences have included an increase in crime, social violence, and ethnic hostility in the 21st century, and continuing economic trauma despite massive wealth. These issues have been examined in a recent publication of mine, Ethnic Anxiety and Competing Citizenships in Trinidad, in a special issue of the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies in July 2020. My essay is on my ResearchGate page and you can access it for free. So ethnic conflict for political purposes has been a feature of local politics since independence, and the conflict has bled into every area of national life. What this has meant for the Indian population from the turn of the century, the present century, though ostensibly in power and possessing economic wealth in the form of businesses and a strong representation in the professions, perhaps numerically greater than their share of the population, that they found themselves in a hostile environment. The media and national and cultural apparatuses, as well as the state apparatus, civil service, judiciary, the police, had been colonized by the other party and encouraged and promoted increasingly violent racial rhetoric at the loss of political power. This took the form of talk radio, reminiscent of figures like Rush Limbaugh in the US, Calypso and Carnival, which were not only promoted as African, but began accusing the Indian population of thievery, corruption, murder, genocide, and a vast array of sins. This might be a good moment to say that Black in Trinidad is not Black in the United States. When I say Black or African in Trinidad, I understand there might be a reflexive assumption that I'm referring to an oppressed minority. Quite the opposite. In Trinidad, the African population is a majority and has held power for more than 2 generations. Black populism in Trinidad practices an Orwellian doublethink, enjoying the license and confidence of a majority, but remaining immured in what Arjun Appadurai called a transnational ethnoscape, consuming phenomena like Black Lives Matter to fuel a sense of victimhood and oppression. Much, if not all, of Black Trinidad's rhetoric and ideas are taken from African-American populism and focuses on organizations like the Nation of Islam, Black Lives Matter, and cherry picks from the excesses of wokeism and cancel culture. Missing from the debate are figures like Thomas Sowell, Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, Coleman Hughes, or even a Candace Owens. Pop culture consumes Charlemagne the God and Tyler Perry's movies, but is unaware of Spike Lee, the sitcom Blackish, and Robin Thede and Key and Peele's parodies as parodies. So Black nationalism in Trinidad is more similar to white nationalism in the US, the wiki-torch wielding quote, "Jews will not replace us" constituency, from whom it takes its sense of grievance, as you will see and hear in a moment. The Indians are the minority and tend not to embrace the label, the oppressed minority. It's a curious and endlessly fascinating polyhybridity, which I will take questions now. But now, I want to focus on one strand of the interwoven thread of history which manifests all the traits I've described above. I'll invite you to look at a short video, 4 minutes, which was broadcast as a Facebook Live a few weeks ago. The man speaking is Yassin Abubakar. I'll tell you who he is and what he did after you hear him speak. And a few of the terms he uses you won't recognize are as follows. SEA, Secondary Entrance Assessment. It's an awful competitive exam children around age 12 in Trinidad are required to take to determine which high school they attend, which for many charts the rest of their lives. Prestige schools. The secondary school system is divided into prestige schools, mainly run by the religious denominations, and government schools, known colloquially as junior secondary schools. The prestige schools tend to be academically successful and have status, and junior secondary schools tend to be less academically successful and suffer from low status. The prestige schools accommodate about 20% of the total number of students. The other 80% of all ethnicities go to government schools. Naturally, the characterization is loose. Many students of state schools do quite well, and many prestige school graduates don't. The issues are stigma and culture. The Concordat is an agreement signed in the 1960s, which allows the religious schools to select 20% of their intake, ostensibly based on religious preference, while allowing 80% to be decided by exam scores. Other than religious instruction and the 20% concession, the Concordat schools are identical to state schools. Same curricula, same teachers, trained at the same universities and receiving the same state funding. But this 20% has become a sore point for ethnic populism in Trinidad, as you will hear. Okay, so let's listen to the video now.
Today I want to begin by giving some solace to many parents who are sad, because yesterday the SEA results came out, and many parents who toiled and labored with their children found that their children were put into schools that they did not expect. They expected their children to be put in the so-called prestige schools, and the children ended up in the junior secondary schools. And so the children, the parents are very sad. I spoke to several parents yesterday, and they're very sad with the choice that was made. But you deserve that. You, your parents, and you deserve worse than that, and you're going to get worse than that. And you call it for Abu Bakr here now. I come out. Why you going to say, where Abu Bakr? Where Abu Bakr? Well, Abu Bakr here now. Well, I'm not saying you come in to follow Abu Bakr, but what is right? Your child put in a class, but a child who would make less than half the marks that your child make, and in the prestige school, how that happen? You allow that to happen. What is the Concordat? What is the Concordat? The Concordat is the denominational school, the Catholic schools, the Anglican school, Asher, wherever it is, the denominational school, who gets all the money to pay all the teachers from my taxpayers' money, and they don't want to pay my teachers. War! I'm addressing you, the Prime Minister, you, the opposition leader, and all your followers, and you, I'm addressing you. You who in charge of education, careful what you're doing this time when you're putting up this Concordat. Careful that you don't leave me out and you don't have my money in taxes that are paid for 46 years for the whole community. Careful! I ain't threatening you, I don't threaten nobody. I warn you and I'm done. Don't fix this society. Then Trinidad, don't fix it. Don't readjust this society. Don't give to the poor what is their due. Don't start to be fair and just. Don't let any prisoners who are locking up for 15 years without a trial. Don't do that, and you will see what will happen. Remember, I warned you today. I warned you today. I warned you 3 times. You are no more wanting to get after this. I want the government of Trinidad to go. I want the police. I want the army, the Coast Guard. I want everybody who is involved in the repression, the oppression of African people. I warn you today, this is your last day warning. If you do not change, you do not adjust this society, it's coming on you. Big protests. Big protests in America. Black Lives Matter, because white policemen indiscriminately killing black men. In Trinidad, is black policemen killing black people. So don't come down to look where you're talking about Black Lives Matter. Black lives don't matter because it's slaves, killing the same slaves. It's black policemen. 99% of the time that a black child is murdered by the police in Trinidad is a black policeman working a mixed black child. And that's why none of your children will end up in the first 20 or 30 of the exam. Not one of you police will come and say, look, my children in the first 10. All is Indians. With the African leader who in charge here. You're ashamed, Mr. Rowley. And this happened this time alone, this happened for the last couple of years. Because you're taking all the money against that man, my money, and ask you for their Indian children, and you don't want to give me a cent for my school. But we'll see what happens now. That's done. That's done.
The man who spoke was Yassin Abu Bakr, who led the 1990 insurrection in Trinidad and Tobago when his radical Islamic group stormed the parliament and took the government hostage. It cost many lives and billions of dollars and continues to affect the nation in the worst ways. I deal with the 1990 insurrection quite extensively in my book, so I won't go into it here. Suffice it to say, Bakr was found guilty, but remains a free man. He is an imam and has emerged as a kind of leader of a sub-state in Trinidad, the part of the country inhabited by a permanent urban underclass whose formation I discuss in my book. What you saw in his speech was a good glimpse into the racial imaginary of Trinidad. Everything is linked to race. Everything came back to Concordat, the victimization of African children, slavery, and Indians being beneficiaries. Let me summarize the main points. He protests the injustice of the Concordat, but the injustice of the Concordat, but specifically the injustice that his school was left out. So he was in effect demanding entry into the Concordat. But there are other Muslim schools in the Concordat called the Asja schools that he referred to. His belief is that African children are being victimized despite doing well in exams, but that isn't true. Many African children do go to prestige schools. Numbers are not generated by the ministry. You can guess why. Ethnic animus is enraged because Indian children are topping the exams, and that's a feature every year. You do see the names and the photographs of the top 10 children are Indian in the SEA exams. And he says it's because of money received by the religious boards. He also says a Black government presided over this. He linked the educational issue to the society-wide oppression of African people, and he manages to get Black Lives Matter in there. He warned and threatened the government more than once. While it is not mentioned in the video, is that he is currently illegally occupying state land and has for nearly half a century, and has threatened violence if he's removed. He has been tolerated by both political parties because he presents a link into the criminal underclass, which they use as necessary. So when Abu Bakr says war, he means it. I've outlined the conflictual nature of the society, but let me trace how education has been intertwined with ethnic conflict. Eric Williams campaigned on education, but in 1962,
Today I want to begin.
In 1962, the opposition parliamentarians complained in parliament, and what you see there is a picture of the Hansard. It's on 14 December 1962, page 719, if anybody in Trinidad wants to check. Williams was blocking the opening of Hindu schools to allow the then largely illiterate Indian population to access education. When Williams saw education as a political background, he complained the Hindu schools were political cells of his opponents. In 1965, he began a battle with the foreign clergy over the religious-run schools. In that year, he produced documents at a public meeting claiming he had evidence of rank discrimination of boys from poor areas in Port of Spain being rejected in favor of boys from upper and middle-class areas. The antagonists were middle-class, white and brown, mixed-race boys, and the victims were Black boys. Interestingly, Williams's answer to the prestige school was the junior secondary school, conceived, built, and operated by his government, but they descended into failure from the start. Once the UNC government came into office, cries of discrimination uttered by Williams resurfaced. Sorry, you don't need that one. All right. A University of the West Indies professor complained in the early 2000s of the imbalance at the UWI School of Medicine, meaning too many Indians were being accepted at the expense of Black students. Around the same time, an American professor of Trinidadian origin began a campaign to establish that Indian teachers in primary schools were discriminating against Black children. The campaign continues in the present, and another American professor of Trinidadian origin has taken up the secondary school issue, insisting that Indians are cheating their way into schools to the exclusion of Black children. The last exhibit shows how established this idea has become in the national imaginary. The article you're looking at now was a series published in early 2020, and it was signed by about 14 people, including a former head of the public service, prominent Black economists, cultural activists, and academics. The proof that the conflict is pursued for its own sake rather than an interest in education is the point none of the apologists make. The schools have the same teachers, same curricula, same funding, and sometimes are next door to, sometimes within 100 yards of one another. Why do these schools perform so differently? And no one seems interested in bringing the schools which do not perform well up to the standards of those that do. There are reasons for the failure of the government schools, which are well known, but which I'll sketch here. I go into some detail in my book. As I said, 300,000 people emigrated from Trinidad between 1960 and 1990, and perhaps another 150,000 in the intervening 30 years. Much of the Black working and lower middle classes emigrated, taking valuable social capital, families, and social networks with them. They were replaced with an unsocialized peasantry from the small islands, who were encouraged to come to Trinidad and replenish the PNM's depleted constituencies. These new migrants were placed in slum constituencies in the north of the island without schools, hospitals, police stations, and socializing institutions. It was the children of these communities which descended into the junior sec schools and brought their communities with them. Those communities had a preponderance of single-parent families, absent fathers, no social networks, violence, and poverty, and are virtually cut off from the mainstream. Thus came a particular culture of violence, abuse, anti-education, and resentment of race, class, and status. There is much research on this, which I actually cite in my book. So what is happening now to the Black community is a culmination of 2 generations of demographic manipulation to win elections and directing resentment to the political opposition, who were majority Indian. But I should say here that the PNM preaches multiracialism, as does the UNC, and it's not false, it is true. However, the rhetoric of race is relentlessly pursued through surrogates such as those identified above. So there it is in a capsule. Post-colonial Trinidad is at war over the same issues that plagued it at its assumption of independence. Let us move now from the particular to the general. Is there a generalized schema to describe what is happening, and importantly, are there solutions? 3 complementary modes of analysis can be undertaken: political demography, institutional policy analysis, and post-colonial analysis. First, the demographic. The Trinidadian situation of a political ethnic majority being threatened by a minority ethnic group is not unique. In fact, similar situations can be found in the United States and elsewhere. The phenomenon of white Americans ceasing to be the majority ethnic group had been foreseen since the last quarter of the 20th century. It generated a great deal of anxiety among the white population, which culminated in the election of Barack Obama and its dual, the election of Donald Trump. An American scholar, Justin Guest, has done some valuable work on this in his book, The New Minority, White Working Class Politics in an Age of Immigration and Inequality. Guest also extended his analysis to other societies from the East and West to illustrate how the phenomenon of the transition of majority populations to minorities due to immigration mainly was materialized in island states. He edited a special edition of the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies last year, where he and 4 other contributors looked at how the phenomenon played out across the globe in the last century. As I've said, I contributed the essay on Trinidad. What can be gleaned from these essays is that the response to other ethnic groups encroaching upon what has been considered the entitlement of majority groups who were, quote unquote, there first, is a universal phenomenon which has been met with a familiar series of political and cultural responses. Conflict is central to all responses. Specifically, Bahrain responded with immigration controls and withholding citizenship for migrants and their descendants. Singapore strictly manages multi-ethnicity and migration with ostensible safeguards for maintaining ratios. Trinidad manipulates public culture and public institutions to symbolically erase the political opposition. Mauritius is an interesting one. Mauritius, the situation of Trinidad is reversed, where the Indian majority actually oppresses the Black minority. This is because the Indians were closer to India in Mauritius. They were closer to Indian nationalism, so they kind of had a direct lifeline. In fact, it's fair to say that the Africans in Mauritius are oppressed in the way the Africans in Trinidad believe they are and fantasize about. Providing a more granular inspection of the large forces Guest applies in a familiar polity, the United States, is the American activist Heather McGhee in her book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone. What Guest describes as a political contest between majority and minority McGee sees as a racial one. She uses data gleaned from her work with the public policy firm Demos and traces the way racism has manifested in public policy and made its way into US institutions driven by the fear of white Americans that their status and wealth were at risk by the growth of minorities. McGee provides two key concepts of the mechanics of majority-minority. First, the idea of zero-sum politics. What you get, we lose. And second, and importantly, is solidarity dividend. That is, in-group emotional bonds are strengthened when repelling incursions from outsiders, which is more valuable than money. She uses a concrete example of white communities filling public swimming pools with dirt and concrete, closing them down and denying themselves their use in the wake of desegregation, which opened them up to African Americans. This fundamentally racist thinking has disguised itself in the language of politics, economics, and social concerns, and manifests as political conflict. As McGee puts it, in the case of the Tea Party opposition to Barack Obama, they, quote, used the language of fiscal responsibility, but the cultural organization of white grievance to mandate blunt cuts in public programs, end quote, which they felt would affect minorities, but which in fact did more damage to the white working class. The echoes of the illustration of conflict, which opened this talk, this echoes the illustration of conflict which opened this talk. In Trinidad, aggrieved ethnic agitators actually prefer to see the prestige schools dismantled rather than allow Indian children to go to them, or reforming the whole system to bring all schools to the academic level of the prestige schools. They cloak the desires for racial vindication in the language of civic concern for children who appear to be falling behind. But another more interesting analytic can be applied to this one. It's called this situation. It's called necropolitics. It comes from the Cameroonian critic Achille Mbembe. Briefly, in examining contemporary societies in general and post-colonial societies in a global and anthropological context, Mbembe proposes a stark schema to describe the orientation of global society. The conflicts of the present century are entirely concerned with what he calls the repeopling of the world from the 16th century onward for the purposes of wealth and wealth extraction and conquest and the use of subaltern races as labor. Henceforth, the theoretical and philosophical justifications of that regime of conquest and the subsequent logic which became embedded in law and custom, economics, political science, and social theory were founded as defense or critique of these movements. Thus, he proposes enmity defines global politics. He says, quote, war in the figure of conquest and occupation, of terror and counterinsurgency has become the sacrament of our times at this turn of the 20th century. And the, quote, blast furnace of colonialism has created two sacraments, war and race. And, quote, everywhere the law of blood and duty to one's race, the two supplements of atavistic nationalism are resurfacing, end quote. In a sense, then, the responses of majorities to minorities described above becomes understandable. If the logic of acquisition, conquest, and domination was built into economics, law, and even moral philosophy, then the reactions of those who benefit from the repeopling to the growing influence of the people would be resistance, resentment, and in the enduring words of Abu Bakr, war. But Mbembe has a few special words for the colony and post-colony. He identifies two kinds of colonies, colonies for settlement and colonies for exploitation, which he calls plantation colonies. In the latter, which is what the Caribbean was, the worst depravities become manifest. He identifies the plantation colony as a third space where the moral dilemma of conquest and its critique had no meaning. It was a place of moral and ethical inversion, and the unconscious primordial desires of the metropole played out, forming what he calls, quote, the nocturnal face of democracy, and a sphere where, quote, unregulated war could persist, and where the most spectacular forms of cruelty have free reign. Two traits of his description stood out for me. One, the violence of democracies was exteriorized onto the colonies and manifested as brute acts of oppression. That's one. So brutality, terror, and violence were constitutive elements of colonial and plantation democracies. But the second one, to me, is crucial. Colonial violence, quote, worked to capture the force of desire of the subjugated and channel it into unproductive investments. That is, the colonial machinery sought not merely to block their desire to live, It aimed to affect and diminish their capacities to consider themselves moral agents. To me, this is crucial in understanding our world. And it is from this bearing of the interior technology of the post-colony, the skin ripped off the Terminator, revealing its steel skeleton, as it were, that a solution can emerge. I had initially intended that the solution to the problem of conflict would come from the American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. In her book, Upheavals of Thought, she describes the creation of compassionate institution by the steeping of people in them, who people them, with moral empathy, reciprocity, and compassion. This would be accomplished through education in the humanities. In her essay, The Death of Pity, she argues that in George Orwell's novel 1984, a book whose fictional society, Oceania, has significant parallels to Trinidad society, pity and other forms of complex emotion have been removed by cultural manipulation, which causes the society to lose empathy and compassion and become embroiled in rage and narcissism. To wit, quote, "The sense of the intrinsic value of the human being is not innate. It is a developmental achievement and it can be blocked." To my mind, this described what cultural nationalism and its centerpiece, the Trinidad Carnival, have done to Trinidad. My study of the post-independence history of Trinidad shows significant moments where the entire population was searching for moral meaning in their lives, which they sought from transcendental meditation, narcotics, professional wrestling, American soap operas, and finally, Facebook. My initial suggestion was that to reform the polity, it was necessary to begin with an emotional revanchism, which could be accomplished through the humanities, teach people to be better people, through the schools, the media, the institutions. Indeed, it is these institutions which are teaching people to be inhuman, as the revelations of the Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen have illustrated yet again. However, the more I thought on it, I realized that this cure has been foreseen and countered, especially in Trinidad over the last quarter century. Art, literature, film, and all forms of artistic expression which teach and evoke complex emotions have been systematically dismantled by the state and by the University of the West Indies. Vidya Naipaul presciently described this in his travelogue, The Middle Passage, and in his novel A Bend in the River, where the revolutionaries decided to kill everyone who could read and burn every book. So I realized that by itself, the humanities can be useful in humanizing populations, but something deeper must be acknowledged. It's dual. Anti-humanism is also a part of our intrinsic makeup. The philosopher John Gray reminds us that, quote, "There are not two kinds of human being, savage and civilized. There is only one human animal forever at war with itself." And Mbembe provides his interpretation of this in terms of social instruments. The pharmacon, the thing that cures us, also destroys us or poisons us. The duality of human beings is a central feature of our existence. We are haunted by our desire for the opposite of what we have. When we have peace, we desire war, but the tools we use for war can also be used for peace. The answer to the counter-reformatory impulse is that it must be anticipated, met, and contended with constantly. Those who desire peace must expect that their alter selves, brothers, cousins, aunts, sisters, mothers, might desire its opposite. A similar scenario is taking place in Trinidad right now with the responses to the COVID-19 vaccination. Both sides desire health and life, but some believe that vaccines save, others believe the vaccines kill. This is another theater of war. As Gray reminds us, it is not the logic of evil that gave rise to Maoist China, Stalinist Russia, or Castro's Cuba. It was the logic of utopia. So strategizing for peace must never stop and cannot confine itself. It must pursue the urge to war and ever be ready for conflict. Until human beings grow out of this bloody phase of our evolution, this is how it must be. Concretely, liberals in the US and elsewhere are slowly beginning to realize that victories, such as the last US presidential election, are transient and ephemeral, and the counterinsurgency begins almost immediately and never stops. As I get the New York Times online, I see the stories about a number of US states now passing restrictive voting laws to prevent minority communities from voting in 2020 and beyond. And John Gray provides me with my closing idea. The most dangerous notion we can have is that progress is inevitable and guaranteed. No such guarantee exists. Our species is balanced on a knife edge between civilization and barbarism. Our civilization is very fragile. Progress must be guarded and defended with the same zeal majority populations guard their privilege, which they acquired off the backs of subalterns. There is no happy ending and there is no enduring peace. We must prepare to live in one or the other. Seen from this vantage, Trinidad's problems are, without too much exaggeration, the problems of the world. Majority-minority racial conflict, using the language of civic concern, progress met by anti-progress. Except that Trinidad's problems are easy to solve, but for reasons I will not go into, the population, oppressor and oppressed, seems to like it so. And I will end there. You have lots of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charitar. Certainly gave us a lot to think about. Let me just you can stop sharing the video.
Can I?
The PowerPoint, yes.
Can I? Okay. Do I do that? Hang on.
And in the while we sort that out, for the let me just remind the audience, if you have a question, you can raise your hand, or you can put it in the Q&A box, and we'll give you the opportunity to ask your question. All right. So let me okay. So very interesting talk, Raymond. While we wait for the questions, I'll kind of take the liberty of asking a couple myself. So you made a very provocative statement. Well, it would be quite provocative to our audience in the United States of linking Black nationalism in Trinidad to white nationalism in the US context. So I would, for the sake of clarity, I want to ask for you to kind of just explain a little bit more why do you see this
Okay.
similarity?
Sure. White nationalism is a majority. It is not a minority movement. It's a racial kind of proposal that, you know, we ought to nationalize on the basis of ethnicity, of race. And one of the things I recall was that the slogan was "Jews will not replace us." So it's a revanchist campaign, but again, it is coming from not an oppressed minority group. It is a majority group which is adopting the language and performance of grievance. So I say that in Trinidad, there's a lot of talk about Black oppression, but Africans have been the majority group for the entire history. They have had political power for 49 or 59 years of independence. They have created all the institutions. They have managed the institutions. Our prime minister, president, chief justice are all Africans. And I say our, I don't say the, I mean they're ours, right? So I don't understand what so the whole thing about ethnic nationalism, it is it might be acceptable as a minority movement. Like during colonialism, Black nationalism was okay because you were a minority movement trying to escape the shackles of colonialism. But it is not acceptable when you are the majority, when you control the institutions. So you are claiming the majority group is claiming we're oppressed, but by whom? You're oppressed by the minority. So in that way, I say Black nationalism in Trinidad is as a majority grievance center has a lot in common with white nationalism in the United States.
Yes, crystal clear. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions here in the chat. One is asking about other institutions outside of education that need reforming to solve the issue of conflict.
Let me just say hello to Novak George, who sent that question. He actually sent questions before he heard the lecture.
Okay.
So that's Trinidadian magic. We don't need to hear lectures before we ask questions. Or you're going to go back. All right. Other than education, you said other institutions need to reform to solve the issues of conflict. Okay. Well, the institutions are, first of all, the political institutions. We have a political system which has a first past the posting. This allows gerrymandering. Okay, it allows you to break up one constituency into three, which has been done in the last month in Tobago. So it's not an abstract thing. You have that. So you could now, instead of winning one constituency with the same number of votes, win 4. So if you were to institute proportional representation, the total number of votes counts, not the number of votes you could pack into one constituency or how many times you could. So that would go a long way, as Guyana has done. That would go a long way to prevent electoral fraud. I mean, there could still be electoral fraud, as Guyana showed us, but it would also go a long way into forcing parties to not pack a base into a geographic area, as it has been done in Trinidad, but you have to appeal to the whole country. It would also allow the emergence of small parties, because in Trinidad, we have the phenomenon of 2 small parties in 1981 and 2007. Both got 22% of the vote, but no seats. That's insane. So that's one of the reforms I was talking about. The other reforms would be to make certain offices elective, like the director of public prosecutions, the police commissioner, make it an elective post. So that that's 2 for now. I mean, if anybody has any more, I'd be happy to kind of talk about that. So yeah, that's what I mean about reforming institutions.
So the police commissioner is selected currently by whom?
By Parliament.
By Parliament.
Yeah, so the majority, there's quite a lot of bacchanal going on here now, because there's currently, at this minute, there is no police commissioner, because well, there was a court case and the court determined that the appointment was illegal and not in step with the Constitution. So there is, as of now, there is no police commissioner. And all members of the Police Service Commission have resigned, and people are asking the president what's going on, and she is not saying anything. So yeah, so those are real things happening now.
So Anton has a question here. I'm gonna want to see if I can make him ask question. Anton, can you speak? No? All right. Let me ask a question then. So he's asking, he says, I'm intrigued by the fact that although an historian, you are so contemporary in your knowledge and reflections. Can you say a bit about the role of the Calypsonian in solidifying the racial class antagonisms that you have highlighted?
Well, well, let me give you in 2019, the last Calypso Monarch show I went to, the second place went to a young woman who sang a song called Loco and Broco, which described Venezuelan immigrants, and we have quite a lot of those here now. The description was horrendous. She described them as whores and thieves. And that got second place. Now, the Calypso Monarch competition is the island-wide competition. Thousands of calypsos enter. It's very political because the political parties appoint the judges and so on, right? So calypso has been kind of a platform for state nationalism. I mean, Calypsonians and it's been kept alive by the government. The governments, the last sum in 2015, the Carnival Commission got $315 million. So it is being kept alive, you know, ostensibly because it is quote unquote our culture, but it's actually not. It is P&M culture. I don't object to the existence of calypso, but I object to the ability to say these things and then move on as if nothing happened. I mean, let me give you 2 examples. In 2002, 2003, a lot of ethnically targeted kidnappings were going on, right? Indians were being kidnapped in the majority. And a Calypsonian got up and sang, "I'm telling my bandit friends to kidnap them." So that's one thing. 2007, there was some rumors that Indian doctors were performing unauthorized hysterectomies on African women. Now, several doctors came out and said, this is impossible. The number of signatures you need before hysterectomy is performed, that's impossible. But it continued to grow. And a Calypsonian wrote a song called Genocide, where she essentially accused Indian doctors of, quote unquote, killing African women. I couldn't quote those in my book because I could not get the permissions, and Palgrave is they have no sense of humor about that, you know, so I couldn't quote those.
Yeah.
And so the great mass of calypso is harmless. There's nothing wrong with it. There's some very good calypsos. But again, you don't look at the mass, you look at the ones that speak to the issues that, and I don't think calypso should be banned or anything. I just think that stop hiding behind that thing of national culture. What you're seeing is hate speech. Okay,
Right.
so yeah, so the Calypsonians have helped. The Calypsonians are in the employ of the PNM. This is widely known. So unfortunately, that's the situation. But again, let me say, I am not saying calypso should be stopped or banned. Okay,
Right.
it is a part of national culture. It is not the national culture.
It kind of reminds me of some of the discussion about dancehall music in the Jamaican context and hip hop in the U.S. context. And I'm kind of tempted to ask if we are seeing the calypso, if we should not see the calypsonian as representing reality rather than creating a reality in this sense. Because if nobody, I mean, in a way, if there's, so what are you saying? The songs that were written about these things, like the hysterectomy and so on, that talks about genocide, are they confirming that, promoting that this is a confirmed finding, or is it a critique? What's going on there? Yeah.
Interesting question. First of all, they state it as fact. Calypso is not known for its, wavering nature. It's a very forceful, direct statement. The hysterectomy calypso, the Loco and Broco one, and another one comparing the Indian government to a child murderer, were written by one man, a lawyer. I happen to know this man. And the problem with calypso is that many of the successful calypsos are written by a very small handful of people. So it's a case of ventriloquism. Calypsos was sung about that it's a handful of composers. So it is not, now there are some calypsos which pose very interesting points, like the education issue I discussed. The Calypsonian Gypsy in 1997 wrote a calypso called Little Black Boy. It was a calypso that asked, why are young Black men failing in our educational institutions, right? It was a very good calypso, and you can find it on YouTube. But that was level. It didn't point any fingers. It's saying, look, why am I seeing my gypsy is a Black man? He said, why am I only seeing little Black boys in jail? So, I mean, people took great offense, so Black people took offense. So when calypso does try to take a provocative issue and ask a question, this is what happens. Other calypsos like Jahaji Bai, after the UNC won in 1995, a mixed calypsonian called Brother Marvin came out with a song called Jahaji Bai, which said that both groups came here on the boat. So it's called a Brotherhood of the Boat, because he is half Indian. And he was, a lot of people liked it, but a lot of people didn't, so the Africans were saying that is not our history. Do not bring us into that. And the Indians were saying, we don't want to go there either. Okay, so in those two instances, yes, the calypso can be used as a kind of dialectical device to throw points of view into contention. But too often it's used as a kind of a prod, a kind of baton or a club rather than a fence, an épée, or a sword. Yes.
All right. There is a question here about other minorities in the population. Do you see any role for them in either trying to navigate this racial dynamic, or in maybe even benefiting from what's
Very
going
good question. Very good question. And thank you for bringing it up. As I write in the first chapter of my book, the minorities, the other minorities, the white, European, Arab, Chinese, they're the richest people in the country. They control the largest businesses, and they control an outsized share of the national wealth. That's been documented. That's not my opinion. And I give references for this. This in 2017, the journalist Anthony Bourdain, the CNN journalist who did a cooking show, came to Trinidad. And he went around to the different ethnic groups and he spoke to them about their ostensibly cooking tradition. Now, in Trinidad, you just do that and the race thing comes up. All right, you just pop, it's spring-loaded. So of course, everybody started to talk about race quite independently of each other. And one member of the Syrian community said, well, we are the 1%. And that just blew up. People were raging about that. He wasn't saying it maliciously. It was a fact. It's a small community. They have done very well. They support each other. They work hard. But of course, you live in a place like Trinidad, of course, people will say all kinds of things about how you got your money. Okay? So the minority groups are so small, they're 1% of the population. They are influential in that they own things, they have a say behind closed doors, they finance the governments and so on. But when that tide of populism turns against them, it's a situation of, they could be in an uncomfortable situation because they're so small, you see.
Right. There's a question on class. Are you avoiding the class issues here? Historical materialism, Raymond.
Class is intertwined with race, yes. I'm not. Right. Class conflict tends to be subsumed into racial conflict. Now, let me tell you how class and race work sometimes in the same thing. In a recent election of the Indian-based party, the Indian leader pulled out the race card and the class card. She said her opponent used a knife and fork, which is a terrible thing because Indians eat with their hands. So when you hear the term knife and fork Indian, you are talking about a division within the Indian community between bourgeois, middle class, and kind of peasant originated. So that happens. In the Black community, there are many, many divisions. But the whole thing of monolithic communities, as you know, as everybody knows, is a myth. Once you examine the monolith, you see cracks almost immediately. So class does exist, but the racial principle is dangerous and it is invoked too easily. So yes, it does exist. And I do, actually what triggered off 1970 which I look at in the book, was not a black-white thing. It was one of the major conflicts of 1970, the Black Power Revolution, was intra-ethnic. It was dark-skinned African people were not being given the same opportunities as light-skinned African people. So that black-brown thing is happening in Trinidad. And there's a very famous Ellie Braffett, Social Stratification in Trinidad. That was the first study of Trinidad in the 50s, republished in the 70s. That talks about that. Earl Lovelace's novels talk about that. And it's a thing, so the class thing exists and the color thing exists.
Right. I'm wondering about C.L.R. James would have read this, What do you think C.L.R. James would have said about your talk in modern Trinidad?
Well, he would have been patronizing, as he would have called me a young fella. I don't know. When I read he gave a lot of lectures in Trinidad in the 60s. And his book, Party Politics in the West Indies, was actually a polemic against the PNM. That book is very difficult to get now. So I mean, he something about the Indians, he said something about a lot of what I'm saying here, that he noticed when he came back in the 50s and the 60s towards independence. He says, people are talking, Lamming said it, he said, people are talking about the Indians in a way that I do not like. George Lamming wrote some pieces in the PNM magazine, The Nation, and the PNM Weekly, and he talks about it. He says, we know that this exists. So I don't know if they, I don't know what they would have, I don't know what they would think, but I think Lamming is still alive. Could ask him.
Yeah, there is a question about the track record, if there is a track record of success for whether historical or contemporary, for the quest for equity between say races in the Caribbean context. Is there like any examples in Trinidad in particular where you mentioned the complaint of the Black Power movement that there was progress in the Black community, but the people who were progressing were not Black enough? Is that
right? Yes, yes.
So could that be one of an answer there, that there is? But then if that's the response, what accounts for that? What's the historical thing that accounts for that progress within that particular subgroup as opposed to others?
All right. Now in Trinidad, I can speak for Trinidad with some authority. I can't speak, all right? Trinidad is like a microcosm. That whole thing of repeopling that Achille Mbembe talked about happened in Trinidad. Don't forget, 300,000 people emigrated between 1960 and 1990. That's a third of the population. And who emigrated? I have newspaper clippings of Williams cussing people, saying, we train you to be teachers and nurses and you're going to Canada to work as maids. He was very upset about that. But also, a lot of people where I lived went, like a whole street went, and this was in the 80s. So you had, when people live in a place for a long time, they know each other, they know the place, they have roots, they have connections, social capital. But when you pull that out, you uproot that, and you place an imported peasantry who don't know the country, who don't know the place, and you place them in ghetto communities, you've created a sub-state. That's a different thing. So these are the people in Trinidad now who can't progress. And the thing is, the unfortunate thing is the culture of those communities is very hostile. So I know some parents don't want their children reading books other than books to pass exams. You know, you go into those communities, it's noise, it's violence. And again, all this is very well documented. So I'm not just talking off the top of my head here. So I think in Trinidad, that whole thing about equity is a bit of a red herring because it's not a race issue, it's a developmental issue. And they are kept in these communities because that's the vote, that's the garrison communities. That's the voting base of the ruling party.
And I think this has to be our last question. By the way, let me just remind the audience of Raymond's new book. You support Raymond. It's A History of Creole Trinidad, 1965 to 2010. It's published by Palgrave Macmillan, 2021. The last question is asking, I guess it's really asking if Trinidad has gotten the leadership it actually deserves in politics. Like it's, you know, if are the politicians not merely reflections of, so I think what the person is trying to ask here is this about poor leadership, or is this about a society that just cannot select transformative leadership?
I don't want to start a cry on Zoom, but it's right now in Trinidad, I can tell you, and this is, let me step out of my academics. I live here, I see what's going on, right? One person is holding back Trinidad. One person, the leader of the opposition. Imagine if Hillary Clinton, after having lost in 2016, refused to leave and was put up against Trump again in 2020. What would have happened? Trump would have won easily. That's precisely what happened in Trinidad. So in a sense, the excesses of the ruling party are kind of, one gets the impression they don't really want to be there. They should have lost. But because of the leadership of the let's call it the Indian party, who thinks that this, I don't know, they think it's a village council that, you know, it's a little shack, they're all, and they want to be in control. The Westminster Convention, when you lose a general, you resign. James Cameron lost a referendum and he resigned. Theresa May lost votes of confidence and she resigned, and they paved the way for Boris. In Trinidad, that doesn't apply. Now, the Times, it has applied in one or two occasions where Mr. Pandey, the founder of the UNC, was voted out and the new leader came in and they won. All right. So to me, I can't remember what got me onto this, but, oh, the leadership, yes. So right now, every person in Trinidad is looking at the country and thinking, one person has us here. But if it were not that person, would it be another? Because this continues to happen in the Indo party and to an extent in the PNM, the Afro party as well. Okay, so yes, it's a situation where we get the leadership we probably deserve, but I mean, good God, we're getting creamed, we're getting flogged here, you know, all of us, every one of us. So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Raymond, for a very nice and very interesting and informative discussion.
Thank you for inviting.
I'd just like to remind our audience that Peace Studies does have this ongoing speaker series, and our next event on the schedule is November 10, right, Mary? When we'll have J.D. Bowers talking about genocide in Bosnia and Serbia, right?
Yes.
And yes, in contemporary context. So he's really going to discuss, you know, we think of this genocide as something that has happened, but he's discussing how it has survived to the present day. And then we have two scholars from the University of from Puerto Rico. At least one is from Canada, one is from the University of Puerto Rico, and they'll be talking about a book that they just published on with reflections on Hurricane Maria, and how it and the issues that came out of that book with respect to climate change. So thank you very much for listening, and go out and buy that book, A History of Creole Trinidad, 1956 to 2010. All right. This is Peace Studies signing out for today. Have a wonderful evening and a nice weekend.
Bye, Dave.
All right, we'll talk.
Bye.